the signers. Introduction. Americans celebrate Independence Day each July 4th because of a document that was adopted on July 4th, 1776. This paper, which announced that the 13 colonies had separated from England and become the United States of America, has been called the nation's birth certificate. Upon hearing about it, George Washington said that he hoped the document would inspire his troops to win the war for independence against England. The paper's stirring words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," have inspired Americans in war and in peace for nearly 2.5 centuries. This document, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. Its roots go back to the 1760s and early 1770s, when England taxed the 13 colonies on tea and other items. In 1774, American leaders gathered in Philadelphia at what was called the First Continental Congress to discuss their grievances. The troubles grew worse. In April 1775, war between the 13 colonies and England erupted at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. A month later, American leaders met again in Philadelphia. When the Second Continental Congress opened in Philadelphia in May 1775, most Americans still hoped that peace would soon be made and that the 13 colonies would return to British rule. But the war escalated, and by the spring of 1776, growing numbers of Americans were considering independence. By then, it had become clear that taxes weren't the only issue. Having lived for generations 3,000 miles from England, Americans had begun to feel like a separate people. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, arose in Congress and read a proposal. Resolved that the United Colonies are, and in right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Many of the delegates were thunderstruck by Lee's proposal. They had discussed separation from England in private, but hearing the words independent states formally presented in Congress was startling. Besides, declaring independence would be the easy part. Actually winning it from the world's most powerful country might be close to impossible. Wanting a few weeks to ponder Richard Henry Lee's independence proposal, the congressmen delayed the vote on it until early July. Should the vote come out for separation from England, they realized, they would need a paper explaining their action. A 5-man committee composed of John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Robert R. Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia was asked to produce a paper explaining why America was declaring independence. The committee entrusted the writing to Thomas Jefferson. The tall, red-headed Virginian wrote the Declaration in about 2 weeks in his Philadelphia lodgings. Jefferson showed the paper to Franklin and Adams, who made a few changes. For example, Franklin improved Jefferson's phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," to "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The Declaration would only be needed if the independence measure passed. Each colony had formed a wartime government that had sent delegates to Congress. If a colony had 5 delegates in Congress, 3 had to vote for independence for that colony to choose separation from England. 7 colonies out of 13, a majority, had to vote for independence for the proposal to be approved. Thomas Jefferson estimated that as of June 1776, 6 colonies were not yet ready for independence. If just one pro-independence colony changed its vote, the measure would be defeated. But the men who favored independence knew that having 7 or even 12 colonies vote for separation from England wouldn't be good enough. For how could a new nation survive with 1 or more colonies still loyal to England? Unless the vote was unanimous, the colonies could wind up fighting each other. On July 1st, the day before the official vote, Congress debated the issues and took a trial vote. The results showed movement towards independence, with 9 colonies now favoring the measure. South Carolina and Pennsylvania were opposed. Delaware was stuck in a tie, with one delegate for independence, one against, and its third delegate, independence man Caesar Rodney, 80 miles away in Delaware. New York's delegates had been instructed by their leaders back home not to vote one way or the other on independence. An amazing series of events occurred over the next 24 hours. Informed by a messenger that he was desperately needed in Philadelphia, Caesar Rodney mounted his horse and headed to the city. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and a few other independence men convinced some delegates who were undecided or opposed that all the colonies must stand together. When the official vote was made late July 2nd, everything fell into place. Two Pennsylvanians who opposed independence, John Dixon and Robert Morse, abstained from voting. This allowed Pennsylvania to squeak by for independence with the slimmest of margins, 3 votes to 2. Wet and exhausted from his all-night ride, Caesar Rodney appeared just in time to swing Delaware's vote to independence. Not wanting theirs to be the only colony against the measure, South Carolina switched to independence. And although its delegates did not vote on July 2nd, New York made the independence vote unanimous several days later. The July 2nd vote transformed the American colonies into the United States of America. The delegates expected that July 2nd would be honored as the new nation's birthday. John Adams wrote his wife, Abigail, that he believed Americans would celebrate each July 2nd as a great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, bells, bonfires, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. But what happened was that after making more changes, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. Copies of the Declaration were sent to the 13 states, as the former colonies were now known. American patriots loved the Declaration, and because at the top of its document it said that the Declaration had been approved on July 4, 1776, Americans began thinking of July 4th instead of July 2nd as the nation's birthday. This misconception about the day when the United States was born has continued to the present time. Another widespread misconception is that all the congressmen signed the Declaration on July 4th, 1776. Most historians think that only John Hancock and Charles Thompson, the President and Secretary of Congress, signed that day. It appears that the full Congress didn't sign a copy of the document until later. Most of the delegates signed the copy on August 2nd, 1776, and others signed even later. On January 18, 1777, Mary Catherine Goddard, editor and publisher of the Maryland Journal and Baltimore Advertiser, became the first person to publish the full Declaration, including all the signers' names. The fact that the Declaration was approved on July 4th, but not signed by most members of Congress until about a month later, meant that those who voted for independence were not the identical group of men who signed the document. About a quarter of the 56 signers had not been in Congress at the time of the vote. For example, Richard Henry Lee was called back to Virginia in mid-June of 1776. As a result, Lee missed the vote for his own independence proposal, but he returned to Congress in late August and signed the Declaration. The signers of the Declaration, rather than those who voted for independence, have long been honored as the nation's founders. That is because, by placing their names on the Declaration, they announced to the world their willingness to risk everything for the cause of independence. The British targeted the 56 signers for special punishment. The homes of 12 signers were burned, and nearly 20 of them lost much of what they had owned. According to some estimate, 9 signers died as a result of the hardships they suffered during the Revolution. Yet not one signer changed his stance on independence. All of them kept the promise they had made in the Declaration of Independence, that they would stake their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor on their country's cause.